It is episode 360, and on this episode I will be talking about AEW Dynamite and Impact Wrestling, discussing a little bit of news, and then I will talk about the story of 360 Wrestling Podcast, why I came up with it, and the rest, the past 10 years on this 360th episode, right here, right now, 360 Wrestling Fanatic. Welcome, wrestling fans, to episode 360 of 360 Wrestling Fanatic. I am your host, Lance Brock, and I just want to thank everyone for listening to this special episode 360 of 360 Wrestling Fanatic. And like I mentioned on Good Morning Wrestling Fans this morning, I did not do an episode last night discussing AEW Dynamite, so I'm going to talk about that tonight. Also, Impact Wrestling and a little bit of news. First, to start things off, I have an announcement to make. Hopefully this will work out. But there is now a 360 Wrestling Podcast premium subscription on Anchor, anchor.fm/360-wrestling-podcast360. I'll put it in the description. If you can, subscribe. It is only $4.99 a month. I'll be doing bonus episodes there and ad-free. You will not hear them here on Spreaker or anywhere else. They'll be exclusive to Anchor for only $4.99 a month, so make sure to check that out if you can. Only $4.99 a month, exclusive ad-free episodes. And that will be probably Fanatic Unleashed, Watch With Me, or anything else I can think of to do over there. And it'll be exclusively on the Anchor Premium subscription. For example, unlike now, where I have to tell you about the E. Hallie Smoke Shop in Southgate, Michigan, and Eureka, like I told you about the other night, they got great prices on vape and all glass, 25% off right now. Make sure you check them out. Also, the Cordial Shop, Taylor, Michigan, Telegraph, just north of Wick. Great pizza, great subs for your football parties this weekend. Check them out. Great prices there as well. And now let's get into this 360th episode of 360 Wrestling Fanatic. Well, it's Thursday, but it's a special episode on a Thursday, so you know what that means. It is time to recap an episode of AEW Dynamite from last night. And it was Championship Fight Night, live from El Paso, Texas. Commentators Tony Schiavone, Excalibur, and Taz. And we start things off with the AEW World Champion in action in the title eliminator match. MJF taking on Konosuke Takeshita, and I was very impressed by this match. Great way to start off Dynamite this week. And Takeshita definitely impressive in this one. At one point hits a deadlift German suplex on an MJF. And then he's beating MJF at one point, and the crowd even starts chanting, "You deserve it," to MJF. I guess they're saying that he deserves the beating that he is getting from Takeshita. And Takeshita impressive in this one as he has been lately. And then MJF puts referee Paul Turner in front of him as Takeshita is getting in the ring and kicks the middle rope, causing a low blow. And at another point, MJF hits a power bomb on the knee, and which ends up hurting his knee. Takeshita gets a Blue Thunder bomb, but he misses a Senton Atomico. MJF locks in an armbar, getting the submission win. And then he hits Takeshita with the Dynamite Diamond Ring, which busts him open. He is bleeding at this point now. And then Bryan Danielson comes out to make the save. MJF exits the ring and goes to the back. Women's action next up on Dynamite. The Bunny taking on Jamie Hayter. Penelope Ford in the corner of the Bunny. And Rebel and Dr. Britt Baker, DMD, in the corner of Jamie Hayter. Good match here. Jamie Hayter gets the win with the Haterade. The AEW Women's Champion is victorious. Once again, good match. And then in the back, Renee Paquette is with Saraya and Toni Storm. And they bring in the librarian, Leva Bates, who we have not seen for a little while. Not on Dynamite anyway. And they attack her and spray paint her. They spray paint an L on her for loser. And then Jamie Hayter and Britt Baker see that and they go to the back. And next up is the Gauntlet, where Ricky Starks, he starts things off with Cool Hand Ange, and then he also goes on to defeat Angelo Parker, Cool Hand Ange, and Daddy Magic, Matt Menard. And then next up is Daniel Garcia and Sammy Guevara. I forgot to mention this, but if Ricky Starks is victorious in this one, he will face Chris Jericho. Good match going on here. Ricky Starks looking really good in this match. And then they go out to the floor and Starks is attacked by a fan wearing a lucha mask and the acclaimed "Oh Scissor Me Daddy" t-shirt and the foam scissors hand of the acclaimed, and no surprise who it was but the Ocho, Chris Jericho. And then Garcia pins Starks. So we will not see that match on this episode of Dynamite. between Starks and Chris Jericho. And to get back to when Jericho was disguised as the Fan, another giveaway of who it was is that he hit the Judas effect. Next up on Dynamite is Rush taking on Bryan Danielson. But before the match starts, we see Bryan Danielson in the trainer's room, and then Jose, the assistant, slams the door shut, and him and Preston Vance are holding the door shut to keep him in. And then in the ring, MJF tells referee Aubrey Edwards to start the match and count Bryan Danielson out, which she doesn't want to, so she does a slow count. And then Bryan Danielson pushes the door open with his shoulder and then runs real quick right down to the ring and is able to make it in time. So now we have the match, Bryan Danielson versus Rush. Danielson is busted open in this one. Hard hitting in this one, I might say might be an understatement. This definitely was a brutal match. But Danielson picks up the win with the Boy Psycho knee to get the win over Rush. Great match. And then MJF hits the ring though. Hits Danielson with the Dynamite Diamond Ring and locks in the Fujiwara armbar. And once again, great match between Danielson and Rush. And next up, the AEW Trios Championships are on the line. Top Flight and AR Fox taking on the Elite, the Young Bucks, and Kenny Omega. And fantastic matchup here. It's just what you would expect when you got, of course, the Elite, the Bucks and Omega, with Top Flight and AR Fox. Great match. The Elite pick up the win to retain the championships. And just an awesome match. And in the main event of the evening, the AEW World Tag Team Championships are on the line. The Guns versus the Acclaimed. And earlier in the night, Lexi Nair was with the AEW World Tag Team Champions, the Acclaimed, and Billy Gunn. And Billy said that he was going to stay in the back and let the two teams do it on their own. Now it is time for the match. Starts off pretty good, a little back and forth, but then the Acclaimed take control. They hit the Scissor Me Timbers, but then the Guns get control of Max Caster, and he's in trouble for a little bit, but then he makes the hot tag to Anthony Bowens, and referee Stefan Smith gets knocked down. Austin Gunn goes out and gets one of the tag team titles, about to use it in the match, but then we see Billy Gunn come out and stop him, but then Colton gets the other tag title and hits Billy Gunn with the other one, and they use the title again, and the Guns defeat the Acclaimed to win the AEW World Tag Team Championships. And you could tell everyone, all the fans there in El Paso, Texas, were definitely disappointed about the Acclaimed losing the tag titles here last night. And it was just a kind of like a hushed silence almost. And they go to the back. The Acclaimed, Max Caster and Anthony Bowens, of course, look disappointed in the ring. And so does Billy Gunn with them. And so the Guns head to the back celebrating their victory. And the Acclaimed left in the ring. And they started playing the Acclaimed theme music again as Dynamite goes off the air. I noticed they did stay on for a little bit. Maybe the match ended earlier than they thought, so they had an extra few minutes left when they started playing the Acclaimed's theme music again. Definitely interesting to see. I'm sure we will see a rematch between these two teams again, possibly March 5th at Revolution. Could be a stipulation added to this one. And I'm sure the Acclaimed will definitely be AEW World Tag Team Champions again in the future. So that was last night's AEW Dynamite on TBS. And now on to tonight's episode of Impact Wrestling on Access TV. And we start things off, we see Matt Cardona arriving, and he's having trouble finding his locker room. And then the guy takes him to this one locker room, looks really nice. And turns out the guy made the mistake that was actually Joe Hendry's locker room. And then he takes Matt Cardona to the correct locker room. And it was a broom closet. So, of course, Cardona was not happy about that. In our first match of the evening, we have Brian Myers taking on Dirty Dango. And Brian Myers picks up the win in the good hands. Take on Tommy Dreamer and Mickie James, Skylar and Hotch. They've been impressive lately. They're taking on Tommy Dreamer and Mickie James tonight. And Mickie James and Tommy Dreamer pick up the win, both hitting DDTs. And Mickie James pins Jason Hotch for the win. But then after the match, the celebration is cut short when Bully Ray attacks Tommy Dreamer and gets face to face with Mickie James, and then Masha Slamovich attacks Mickie from behind, gets a snowplow, and Bully Ray and Slamovich stand tall over Dreamer and James. And now we see the debut of Steph DeLander taking on a former Impact Wrestling Knockouts champion, Jordan Grace. Jordan Grace picks up the win. DeLander not victorious in her debut on Impact Wrestling. Knockouts tag team action up next. The Death Dolls defeat Taylor Wilde and Killer Kelly. And while they're celebrating their victory, they are interrupted by Father James Mitchell. He tells Rosemary it's been quite some time since they've crossed paths, He says Jessica reminds him of somebody he knows. Then he reveals he was sent to put a hex on Rosemary. And then we see the tag team known as the Hex, Allison Kay and Marty Bell, as they attack Jessica and Taya Valkyrie from behind. And Rosemary runs in, and then they attack her as well. And backstage we see Eddie Edwards, and he asks Shira Mahabali Shira to take out PCO tonight. And Shira and PCO gets the win, defeating Shira. And in the back we see GM Miller with Matt Cardona. He said he had to change in the parking lot. And then there's a few guys singing, Joe Hendry's theme song. And the main event for tonight, the Impact Wrestling Digital Media Championship is on the line. Joe Hendry taking on Matt Cardona. Pretty good match here, I thought. Good main event anyway for TV. Joe Hendry gets the win to retain. Big fan of Joe Hendry, and these two worked a good match together as well. And then after the match, when Hendry is celebrating, he plays the new hit song that he has that is about Matt Cardona, known as Edge's B. This is a family podcast. And that was tonight's Impact Wrestling. Pretty good episode this week. I enjoyed it anyway. Next week, though, for Impact Wrestling, we have Chris Bay taking on Kushida, Eddie Edwards and Heath, Steve Macklin versus Rhino, and Rich Swann versus Kenny King in the main event. I didn't mention it in the recap, but Rich Swann was in the back with Josh Alexander talking about their Impact World Championship match at Rebellion. And then they were interrupted by the KING, Kenny King. So we will see that match next week. Rich Swann taking on Kenny King. That should be a good one. Both very talented wrestlers who will be going at it right there next week. And now to get into a little bit of news, there is some good news about WWE Hall of Famer, legendary Jerry the King Lawler, who suffered a stroke earlier this week. The good news is that he is now out of ICU, and they said he should make a recovery. So far it does look pretty good. And that is good news. Once again, just like the other day, I want to mention speedy recovery to Jerry the King Lawler. And another note from tonight's Impact Wrestling, to go back to it again, Deonna Purrazzo will take on Giselle Shaw at No Surrender on the pre-show February 25th, either on Impact Plus, or you can also order the show on Fight TV. And AEW now has a deal to broadcast on ESPN in Australia, New Zealand, and Pacific Islands. So that does sound like good news for AEW. Internationally, anyway. So it looks like that Paul White, the former Big Show, does want to get back in the ring. So we might see Paul White wrestling again in AEW, or not again in AEW, but I meant wrestling again. Not quite sure when or if he will make his in-ring debut in AEW. Or maybe he'll bring back Captain Insano again, like he did for the acclaimed music video. We will have to wait and see. And WWE announced today that the SmackDown before Money in the Bank, which will be in England at the O2 Arena, the SmackDown the night before will be broadcasted live for the first time from London, England. So I'm guessing this is only for England. We'll be broadcasting live. Here in the US, I don't think it will be. I'm guessing it will be the regular time. But in England anyway, on BT Sport, it will be broadcasted live. And lastly, it has been confirmed now that the AEW Fight Forever video game will have a T for teen rating, and the release date for the video game might be pushed up a little bit. I have to admit, what I have seen and heard about the new AEW video game, the first AEW video game, kind of makes me want to get a new gaming console or play, what's that computer thing, Steam, you can get. We'll have to see though. And like I mentioned this morning on Good Morning Wrestling Fans, SummerSlam coming to Detroit, Ford Field, August 5th. That would be great to be able to go to. And that's it for the news. And before I wrap up this episode of 360 Wrestling Fanatic, since this is the 360th episode, episode 360, I wanted to kind of talk about, I might have mentioned some things before on the podcast, but I just want to kind of go over it again, kind of, I guess you could call the story of 360 Wrestling Podcasts. And, well, at first it was only one podcast, 360 Wrestling Fanatic, in 2012. And at the time, I was really starting to get into podcasts or other wrestling radio shows, whichever you want to call them. Started listening to shows at the time like Live Audio Wrestling, Monday Night Mayhem, The Wrestling Observer, Wrestling News Live, In Your Head, different shows and podcasts like that were online. And I started listening to them. I really enjoyed them because before then I did hear one wrestling radio show. It was like a national syndicated show, which was back in 2000 or so, 2001. And here in Detroit, it was on 101 WRIF. And they did talk wrestling, but it was also music too. They did play some rock music and stuff. Well, of course, if you're in Detroit, you know that WRIF is the rock station here. And they did talk wrestling, but they played music in between, and they did have some music, or I meant to say interviews, with some of the top stars at the time, which was WWF and WCW at that time. It was a good show, but it didn't really last too long, and then that ended up going off the air. And like I said, I started listening to podcasts online, and there was also at one time another radio show here in Detroit, which was a local one, called Wrestling Elite. I want to say that started around 2007 or so, and that lasted about a year or two maybe. Good radio show. Had some good wrestling talk. It was mainly WWE and a little TNA. And then I started finding even more podcasts online. And ones I listen to the most, I already mentioned, but Live Audio Wrestling, and which now is no more after the Fight Network was purchased by Anthem, or they already owned Anthem, I should say, but after Anthem purchased Impact Wrestling, they changed some things, and Live Audio Wrestling split up. Jason Agnew started Sunday night's main event, but then John Pollock and Wei Ting went on their own to start Post Wrestling, which I always talk about even now, how I'm a big fan of Post Wrestling, listen to all their podcasts, and I would have to say John and Wei were two of the biggest inspirations, I guess you could say, that really got me wanting to do my own. Of course, I love talking pro wrestling, and I thought an idea of being able to have my own show where I just talk about anything I want, what's going on in pro wrestling, any promotion, wrestling all over the world, and give my opinion on it. I thought that was a cool idea, but I didn't really know how to do it. I definitely not the best, smartest tech person in the world. So then finally I found Blog Talk Radio, where you could call in on the phone and do your show. So I did that for a little bit. And to come up with a name for it, I was thinking, actually, if I ever had my own promotion. For a while I thought about 360 Wrestling. That was just one of the names for some reason that popped into my head. And I have always said, people who know me, I've always said that I am a wrestling fanatic. So I thought of 360 Wrestling Fanatic Radio. And at first, that's what it was called. Called it 360 Wrestling Fanatic Radio. It was on Blog Talk Radio at first for a little bit. And then I wanted to come out with, or do the podcast another way, where I didn't have to do it over the phone, where it could sound better, more clear. And then I found other websites like Podomatic. I did that for a little bit, and then eventually I found Spreaker. Very good. And then Anchor eventually started using that, and I don't use Anchor quite as much these days, but every once in a while I do an episode on there. But as I mentioned at the top of this episode, that new premium subscription on Anchor, so I will be using Anchor now. Exclusive episodes will be airing there. So, Spreaker, very good. And this being episode 360, I just want to say, actually there should be more episodes, but there has been times where I have taken breaks. The reason is they're mostly because I've gotten discouraged, because I just feel like I am not good at this, even though I enjoy doing it, but I'm not good at this. And there's been times where not really growing the podcast, and just get real frustrated and down on myself about it. So there was times I wanted to quit, and I have gone for a little while without doing any episodes or anything. And at one time I really thought I was done, and then there were a couple other things that happened where I kind of took breaks from the podcast. But last year I came back and started doing it more and got a little better. That's not saying much, because I still don't think I'm good. I do stutter sometimes, and I mess up, say the wrong thing, and I definitely am not a good talker. But like I said, the main reason I do it is just because I love talking pro wrestling and love having a way to get out online and talk about it, give my opinion about what's going on of pro wrestling all over the world. And that is why I do it, mainly just because for my love of pro wrestling. And I have had some interviews, and luckily I think all the interviews, or at least most of them, have went very well. I remember back in 2012, I remember what show it was too. It was Clash Wrestling Fight Against Cancer 5 at the Taylortown Trade Center, and where I recorded my very first interview with Leah Von Dutch, who would later go on to become Leah Vaughn. And then the second one I remember too, which was at another Clash Wrestling show at the Scarecrow Festival in Trenton, Michigan, on a cold October day. It was raining, and the former co-host Tony, I'm sure if you're a long-time listener of 360 Wrestling Fanatic, you remember Tony. And it wasn't a real big show, but they had 4 matches, I believe, and it was even streamed online at the time. But like I said, rainy, cold October day here in Michigan. And we stayed after the show and interviewed our second guest in 360 Wrestling Podcast history, Wrecking Ball Randy Casey. I'm sure you can, if you search for that, Google it, you can probably find it. And then I would go on to interview Wrecking Ball quite a few times. And the other podcast that would eventually debut, Clash Wrestling 360, which was hosted by the other Lance Brock, which I haven't seen him in years. He's been gone for quite a long time now. But you can still go, I'm sure, find those episodes of Clash Wrestling 360 with Wrecking Ball Randy Casey. And then another guest that was on a few times, amazing Nate Manson. He was great to have on. And I interviewed Zach Gowen, who was great to talk to him. Great interview. If you can find that one, I definitely recommend listening to that one. He did a great interview, and did a live interview with him at a Clash show with his tag team partner at the time, the Handicapped Heroes, him and Gregory Iron. I believe it was right after they won the Clash Tag Team Championships from Dragon Greed and Gavin Quinn. And another one I've interviewed is Xandra Bale, who, along with Leah Vonda, used to appear at Clash Wrestling shows. Interviewed with Eddie Venom, very great guest. And Clash Wrestling 360, one who was on the most with not only myself, but then the other Lance Brock, Caveman Elk, who, if you listen to Clash Wrestling 360, I'm sure you heard those episodes where they were the Beard Brothers. Definitely recommend those episodes of Clash Wrestling 360 that the Caveman Elk appeared on. Good podcast there, or at least in my opinion anyway. I know that other Lance Brock has had a bad attitude sometimes. If you remember, there was a time where he wanted to be a part of the group The Clash with Wrecking Ball Randy Casey, Tommy Tresnick, Cameron Sky, and Jack Vaughn. He actually thought he was a part of that group. He was a little full of himself. And then when the Clash ended up going into the future and becoming the H3RD for Clash to the Future, and the Clash was no more, so then he ended up becoming the Beard Brothers with Caveman Elk. Another Clash Wrestling 360 guest. A great guest. Another one, Maserati Rick, who was a former Clash champion, the Midnight Society. And he was on quite a few times with the other Lance Brock on Clash 360. They even referred to themselves as Elroy and Astro. So if you can, those are other good episodes to listen to. And Ringmaster B, who would later become Belvedere, was on Clash 360. And Clash Wrestling 360, that was a good podcast, even though it was hosted by the other Lance Brock. And even though another guest, my boy D from Heel Fan News, and even the other Lance Brock appeared on Heel Fan News. You can find that on their YouTube channel if you want to check that out. So that was Clash Wrestling 360. Like I said, you can still find those episodes. And then after that, and then I came up with one. Now I think the name is pretty bad, but at the time I wanted to do another show, Awesome Extra. Now that name doesn't sound as good to me as it did at one time. I don't know why, but for some strange reason at the time, I thought that would actually be a good name for a podcast, where it was kind of pretty much the same idea of Fanatic Unleashed is now, where I talk about either a past show or a certain wrestler or a certain pro wrestling topic that is separate from 360 Wrestling Fanatic. And then at one time I wanted to change the name. I wanted something different than 360 Wrestling Fanatic. So I came up with one called 360 Championship Wrestling Radio. And now that I think about that, that's not that great. But I remember at the time, and this was the first time I got a message about somebody calling, or not calling, but it was on the Facebook page. And I got a message from this referee on the Indies, Chris Sharp, who would go on to ref in NXT. But at the time, he was still doing the Indies, and he worked a little bit with WWE, maybe reffed a match or two at the time, and did a little bit even with Impact, I believe. And I'm sure you can find that one still if you look for it, search online, whatever. But that was also a very good interview. Like I said, it was the first time that anybody contacted me about wanting to come on to the podcast. Had a great interview with them. And so I changed Awesome Extra to TBT for Throwback Thursday. And that didn't really last too long. And then that became Fanatic Unleashed. And also, I started seeing these things like on podcasts, YouTube, different things like that, of watch-alongs, where I know different podcasts do this, and where they watch things where you can also watch with them. And I wanted to do something like it, but I wanted to come up with my own name, so I came up with the podcast Watch With Me, and did some of them, and hopefully that'll be returning soon. Hopefully. And then my niece and nephew, Madison and Bruiser Brody, have been on Watch With Me and the unboxing videos that are on the YouTube channels. So hopefully 360 Wrestling Podcast now will continue to maybe grow in the future and maybe become kind of good. Probably, well, in my opinion anyway, probably the worst podcast there is in the world, but like I said, I like doing it anyway. It's fun still. Hopefully I will keep doing it and not get down on myself and want to quit. And hopefully people will listen, Or at least I hope so anyway. But that's all for this episode. Episode 360 of 360 Wrestling Fanatic. Thank you very much for listening to this episode and all the other podcasts. And next up will be 361. Stay tuned, and I will be right back tomorrow morning for Good Morning Wrestling Fans Friday episode. Tomorrow, SmackDown and Rampage. Thanks again for supporting 360 Wrestling Podcast by listening. Remember, you can listen just about anywhere you can find podcasts. Here on Spreaker, the main site, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Anchor. The new premium subscription episodes will be there soon. Ad-free, exclusive episodes, that is. And remember, Facebook, 360 Wrestling Podcast, Instagram, 360 Wrestling Podcast, Twitter, at 360 Wrestling Pod. If you have any suggestions or about an episode of Fanatic Unleashed, or any comments, anything, you can leave them in the comments here on Spreaker or wherever you listen to the podcasts at. Or you can email 360wrestlingpodcast@gmail.com. Once again, the email is 360wrestlingpodcasts@gmail.com. That's all for this episode. Tune in tomorrow for Good Morning Wrestling Fans. But hey, until then, I am Lance, and I am a wrestling fanatic.